idea, so I guess I'm going to start right now. All right, so this is great. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the people who are online. So the Genetics and Genomics Academy is really has been doing a lot of things over the last few years, but we really are trying to figure out what our role is going to be in terms of outreach, in terms of us helping to inform high school teachers and other teachers about where genetics is going, what's brand new information, so that they have a better ability to teach their students. And so that is what led us to inviting Brian Donovan. And we have also reached out and got great support from a lot of other groups on campus. The Genetic Engineering and Society Center is co-sponsoring this. And you should know that Brian is giving this talk, and then at 4 o'clock, he's going to be involved in a panel discussion that's being put on by another one of his sponsors, which is the Kenan Fellows Program for Excellence in Teaching. And he's also been going to be talking with the folks from the College of Education. And Gail Jones is here with her graduate students. So we've had a lot of interactions for Brian, and we're hoping that this will be good discussion today and tomorrow when there'll be the colloquium at the Genetic Engineering and Society Centers in the 1911 building at noon. But we're using this as a way of starting to sort of seed some interest and interactions that could lead us to better define the role of the Genetics and Genomics Academy in terms of outreach in North Carolina. So that's my shtick on that. So I just want to tell you just a little bit about Brian. He got his Bachelor's of Arts in biology at Colorado College, and then he went on to get a master's in art in teaching at University of San Francisco, and also a master's degree in biology at Stanford University, and at the same time a PhD in science education at Stanford University. He is working with what's called now BSCS, which is hard to find out what they really are, but they started out in the 1950s during when the Cold War started, and then they were developing biological science curricula, and that's how it all started out. And obviously Brian is involved in that now. He started out as a research scientist there, and now a senior research scientist. He's gotten awards, and I'll just mention a couple that I think are really relevant. He got the National Association for Research in Science Teaching Early Career Research Award, and he got an award for the most downloaded paper in the journal Science Education. And go back a ways, he got in 2009, before he got a $2,000 award for his teaching excellence at San Francisco Independent Parochial Schools group. And this goes back to the fact that Brian is not just an academic. He has a lot of credentials in teaching. So he taught elementary and middle school from 2004 to 2006, and then middle school science from 2006 until 2011. So he's gotten that interaction. And also just to mention that, for people who bean count, he's got $3 million worth of grants going right now where he's the PI. I say this not just to emphasize Brian's ability to do that, but it's good that the National Science Foundation is investing in these kinds of things. And I'll just mention, so he has one grant, which is collaborative research on exploring how learning about genetics of sex differences impacts genetic essentialism and STEM belonging and interest. And then he has another grant that is more along the lines of what he's going to be talking to us about today. So without taking up any more of your time, I'm going to let you tell us about it.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me out today. Really happy to discuss my work. The argument that I'm going to make today is that genetics education needs to move beyond teaching about just Mendel and his peas and single gene inheritance if it wants to accomplish what I consider a really important goal for genetics education, which is combating the spread of white supremacist misinformation. And that's, I recognize, a provocative argument to make. So I'm going to take some time to unpack why I think genetics education is flawed, what I think we need to do about those flaws in today's world. But before I get into that, some of you might be wondering, like, how did this white guy come to investigate genetics education and race? And the short answer there is my grandparents. So these are my grandma Julie is on the right, my grandpa Victor is on the right. They are in a refugee camp after World War II right here. A lot of people don't remember. I mean, we remember the Holocaust because of work that we've done to remember it. In addition to the Holocaust, 1.9 million non-Jewish Poles, ethnic Poles, were murdered as well. And my family was caught up in that. So my grandfather was in the first battle of World War II. He was captured by the Nazis, spent 6 years as a prisoner of war in a camp. My grandmother was kidnapped from her farm in southern Poland and was in a slave labor camp for the duration of the war. And, my grandparents never talked about that stuff, obviously. But, it was all said in their face, essentially, and in their body language. My mom immigrated to the United States through Ellis Island, actually, in the 1950s. She's one of the last generations to go through Ellis Island. The ethnic persecution that my grandparents faced in Europe, that didn't end when they came to the United States. My mom was told by one teacher that she would amount to nothing. Some, though not all, families in their small upstate New York town forbid their kids from playing with my mom because she was a dirty refugee. And what some of us don't remember, from those of us who grew up in the 80s and the 90s in particular, is like I grew up with a lot of quote unquote dumb Polish jokes. So jokes about how stupid the Polish were, right? And that's all part of this legacy, right? Because the justification for the genocide in Europe was all motivated with genetic ideas, right? So there's lots of different reasons why I do this work, but I think as foundation, the thing that kind of drew me into it was just the stories that I grew up with. And so that story transpired a long time ago. What I want to start with today is a more modern day story, and it begins with my friend Kay. So Kay is a high school biology teacher in the Midwestern United States. And like many of us biology teachers, we have memorable experiences learning biology. That's why we got into it, right? So Kay remembers, when she was in AP biology, she remembers multiplying fractions, drawing squares, but not fully ever understanding why they were doing all that work all the time. But more importantly, she remembers thinking to herself that her genes were her destiny during her science class. There was no escaping her family's history. And that idea right there, that genes are destiny, it's been, discovered, I guess you could say, by many different people that it is either tacitly or implicitly present in the biology curriculum. And sometimes it is actually an explicit concept that organizes how teachers instruct about genetics. And if we go back through history, of course, we know that idea played a big role in the eugenics movement, which was not just a thing in genetics, right? That was like an ideological movement within the United States that tied together research in many different fields in the biological and the social sciences. We also know that this idea of a genetic destiny was used to rationalize a lot of Jim Crow segregation laws to keep the white gene pool pure, essentially. But what we often forget, but now is kind of coming to light more and more through modern historiographies, is that a lot of the ideas that the Nazis used to create the final solution and to create the policies that led up to that were actually just imported from American segregationists and American race science. So we have this unfortunate back and forth, right? We fast forward to the present. Kay ends up earning a PhD in molecular biology from Stanford. And like many new teachers, she did what we all do when we're overwhelmed and we have kids in the classroom. We just revert back to the way that we were taught ourselves, because it is a really difficult thing to teach and it is very overwhelming. And so Kay ends up hearing herself saying things to her students every now and again that like DNA is their destiny, right? And now deep down, Kay knew that the science of genetics was far more complicated than Mendel and his P's and a Punnett square and single gene inheritance. But, when it came to teaching in her classroom, she wasn't necessarily communicating that to her students. And that discrepancy between what she knew to be true, which is that the science of genetics is complicated, and what she was teaching her students as truth, which is like single gene inheritance and this Punnett square can do a lot of explanatory work for us for all kinds of human traits. That was kind of gnawing away at her when I first met her, which was at BSCS where I work, which is a science education nonprofit. We develop biology curriculum. We do research on biology education and science education in general. But we were starting to discuss our new high school biology curriculum. And that's kind of where all this came out, because we were trying to re-envision, well, what is the genetics curriculum going to look like in our school? And so, Kay was worried that the way she was teaching genetics could be entrenching some racist misunderstandings in her students. Given the history of the science, that idea, that concern was not entirely far-fetched or misplaced. And so I asked her if she'd be willing to do something scary. I asked her if she'd be willing to teach her students about race, to challenge racially biased ideas. And, she said she was up for the challenge and she was interested, but she was concerned about doing that, as I think anyone who's actually thought through what that would entail might feel, right? So she was worried that if she did that, she might unintentionally commit a public act of racism and hurt she has lots of students in her classroom and hurt many of students of color in her classroom. That was the big worry. And, I said to her, well, what if, doing this kind of teaching and learning didn't harm your students? What if it actually helped them? And what if we really need to do this right now? And so you can imagine how Kay responded to my call to action. And so the same argument that I made to Kay, I guess at this point, like 4 or 5 years ago, is the same argument that I want to make to you today, which is that if we don't change the way we teach genetics, then we might be accelerating the spread of misinformed ideas about race and genetics, like allowing for that spread to occur. But if we do change it, then we have this really great opportunity, because genetics education is really the first and the last place where people formally learn genetics. So we could vaccinate our youth against misinformed ideas about race and genetics in the genetics classroom. So that's kind of the big provocative thing that you're going to get to consider today. And to do that, I think we need to move beyond Mendel. We need to get into more complex forms of inheritance. We need to help kids learn about genomics and human population genetics to do that. I'm not arguing, just to be clear, that we should stop teaching about single gene inheritance, stop teaching about the brilliance of Mendel, because there's a lot of great stuff in there. Just saying we need to move beyond it. We need to do more than just that in middle and high school biology education. So the reality is, the reason why I think we need to do this is because kids are exposed to a lot of racist misinformation online. There's 15 million high schoolers, give or take a few 100,000 in the United States, and 3/4 of them go online several or more times a day, in particular YouTube. I don't know if anyone has a middle school boy in this room. I do. He is on YouTube all the time. All the time. There's just so much content on YouTube that kids learn, but studies are now showing that there's a correlation between YouTube usage and exposure to misinformation about race and genetics. And in particular, work by Aaron Panofsky at UCLA has shown that a lot of these ideas include genetic concepts and ideas about race that are circulated in racist manifestos online. So typically these are manifestos that are posted either before or after a massive hate crime. So for example, one of these is Anders Breivik, who in 2011 murdered 77 people in a racially motivated hate crime in Norway. And so I've read these things, is what I do sometimes, because you have to kind of get your head into what people are arguing if you're going to do this work in a science classroom. And so this is from Breivik's manifesto. It says blue eyes and blonde hair and possibly many psychological traits almost never survives a race mixing process due to the fact that Nordic genotypes are recessive, unlike African, Arab, or Oriental genotypes, which are considerably more genetically dominant. If you read between the lines here, you see a lot of classic canonical phenomena and concepts in the Mendelian curriculum. So we have blue eyes versus brown eyes, recessive and dominant genotypes, despite the fact that, of course, eye color is actually a polygenic trait, right? Textbooks don't really discuss that complexity. But this is teed up for kids who have learned Mendelian genetics, and that's it. It's going to resonate with the conceptual understandings that they have. The cognitive resources that kids have developed are going to fit really well with these ideas right here. So that's the kind of misinformation that is spreading online right now. It's like that. That's not an exhaustive search, but if you want to learn more about it, read Aaron Panofsky's work, because the white supremacist community is very systematic. It is very efficient in disseminating ideas and arguments online. And that's what is coming up in videos. And it doesn't take long. Read the Washington Post or the New York Times, there's all these stories sprinkled out how, it's just a few clicks away that can get kids to this misinformation. So it's not like something that's just not present online. So we think about it, 3/4 of kids are on YouTube every day, several more times a day, and 17% of kids could be exposed to misinformation about race and genetics, just like I showed you right there. We combine that, then let's say generally, ballpark back of the envelope estimate, 13% of high school students could be exposed to misinformation like that at some point during the 4 years of their high school learning experience. So that's roughly 2 million high school students. And to put that in context, that's roughly 30 students per middle or high school in the United States. Because these numbers are so big, it's so hard to think about what's the real impact here. 30 kids per secondary school is actually quite a bit, if that's what it is. I don't know if it is, but that's just a ballpark estimate. But nearly 100% of kids take biology. 98% of kids take biology at some point during their 4 years of high school. So that really makes high school biology this great place where we're learning genetics at some point during those 4 years. We can actually do something about this problem if we want to do something about it, right? So then you might be wondering, like, well, what do you think we need to do? Like, are we just going to teach kids genetics and they're going to figure this stuff out all on their own? And, life is like never that simple. It's very difficult to help people change, to put people in a situation, in an environment where they can learn about complex concepts, for one, and then do it around something that's charged as race and feel safe enough to actually change their ideas or their beliefs. So, and right now, like, I see essentially 3 barriers in genetics education that we would need to overcome if we are going to work toward the goal that I'm talking about here. So the first thing, like I said before, is we need to move beyond Mendel. We need to learn some more complex genomics concepts. And it's complicated to learn those ideas. Genetics education isn't set up to teach those ideas. And even if we solve those 2 problems of how to help kids understand these complex concepts, systematically across the United States, you still have this problem, like, who are going to be the teachers who are going to do this work in their classroom? Because it's not like your everyday kind of teaching, right? So first point, what do I think kids need to know? We're still working this out, but there are essentially 5 interrelated ideas that I think are really important. The first one is that 0.1% of the human genome is variable DNA that differs between individuals. That doesn't seem like a lot of DNA, but there's like roughly 3 billion nucleotides on average. So we're talking about 3 million nucleotides of difference. And that difference is responsible for why we all look different in this room, right? It's responsible for a lot of things. And the debate about race in the white supremacist community online is about that 0.1%. It's parsing that up. What does it mean? How important is it? So it's not enough just to teach kids, like, 99.9% of the sequence is the same across any 2 individuals. That's a relatively unconvincing counter argument. We need to get into this 0.1% and what it means, right? Now, when population geneticists have looked at that 0.1%, since going back to, Lewontin's 1972 study of blood polymorphisms, they found the same finding over and over again. There's more genetic variation within continental populations than across them. And continental populations that we typically associate with US census racial categories in the United States. So like sub-Saharan Africa versus Europe versus East Asia, and so on and so forth, right? So what does that really mean? Well, that means that two people of two different genetic ancestry groups are just slightly more different from one another than two people of the same group. That is it's easy to say, it's very difficult to understand because statistically what we're talking about is an intraclass correlation coefficient. And wrapping your head around that in linear mixed models, that's something you study in graduate school, right? So the challenge is to learn that conceptually at the middle and the high school level, which is a really challenging thing to do. And what we find, what we now have arrived at, is about 5% of genetic variation occurs across groups, proportionally speaking. So then in the white supremacist community, what you often hear is that, oh, well, maybe that 5% of DNA that differs between groups might not look like a lot, but it's really important, right? It's the driver of all the racial disparities in society. So that's why I think the next thing kids need to learn is, well, hold on a second. Complex human traits, they typically have a very weak association with genetic variation. That's what we've learned from about 20 years of genome-wide association studies, that the narrow sense heritability of GWAS studies is usually far below what was originally measured in a twin study. There's this missing heritability problem. Eric Turkenheimer at UVA has written a lot about that. And that's not to say that complex human traits have no genetic basis. They certainly do, but it's not the same kind of strength or magnitude or power that a lot of people in the public give to genes when they're thinking about complex human traits, right? So it's something like educational attainment, only 11% of between individual variation in European Americans is associated with polygenic scores, okay? So we need to help kids understand that kind of complex stuff. That's not easy to figure out. I don't know if anyone in the room, I didn't learn about genome-wide association studies, again, until I was in graduate school. So then some people say, yeah, but complex human traits, they still have, they're still based in genetics. So that must mean that racial disparities have a genetic basis if complex traits are genetically encoded in some level. And the problem we have there, these are really two very old ideas. They go back to the early 20th century, and they have to do with the common garden experiment. We actually can't say that because we've never randomized people into different environments like we've done in animal breeding studies to get an unconfounded estimate of the genetic contribution to complex traits. We can approximate it, but we haven't conclusively shown it for any single trait because it's unethical to do those studies. So no one's done the fair scientific test to determine if inequality is due to our genes, all right? I think if you understand these 5 ideas, you have enough time to build an understanding of it, then you can start to see the flaws in white supremacist arguments. So some white supremacists, they like to claim that, there's racial purity in some groups, that people of the same race are genetically homogeneous. Well, that idea is flawed because most genetic variation is found among individuals of the same group on average. Some white supremacists claim that there's more variation between groups than actually exists. And that idea is flawed because actually population genetics shows, if you carve up people into racialized populations, you can find genetic differences between them. They're just not as big as a lot of people might think. A lot of people kind of overestimate how different human groups are. They're different, but they're not that different, right? A lot of white supremacists will claim, well, somewhere at some point, someone's going to find the super important gene over here that is the difference maker for this trait. And while it's true that there are some causal variants that have a big impact on a disease phenotype and stuff like that, it's typically only a small minority of people in any single population who have that gene variant. So the whole distribution of the disease cannot be explained by a single gene. Typically, the explanation is much more complicated. We never teach kids that. And then finally, I think the thing that we really need to focus our attention on in science education is an idea that I think everyone could understand if they had a high quality science education. We rarely ever do this, which is that correlation is not necessarily causation. So if we have two different groups and they differ in their trait values, their allele frequencies, and their environmental exposures, which is like most racial disparities in society, you see these 3 things happening. Well, then it's actually hard to say if the disparities are due to genes or environments. And that's because there are no scientific tests that have been done using randomized designs to place people in different environments to weed out the confounding effect of the environment in a genetic contribution to a trait. And we might fool ourselves into statistically thinking we can parse that out with fudge factors in population genetic studies, but it doesn't work out. And I'm happy to talk about that later. So, what we do have control over is our social environment. It's limited control. We can create new policies. We can do different things. It's hard to do. It's messy. Politics gets in the way, all kinds of things, right? But let's just run this simple thought experiment. Imagine we gave everyone equal access and opportunities for 400 years or more. Everyone gets housing. Everyone gets healthcare. Everyone gets high quality teaching. Just run that thought experiment. You do that for 400 years, and there's still racial disparities in education. Then you're in a much stronger position to claim that they're genetic. As far as I know, no one's done that, right? And what you hear instead from the white supremacist community is they say, well, first of all, they never tell you that racism should be eliminated. And what they're going to say is that there's no point in doing that because it's natural. It's caused by genetics. So there's no point in doing anything about it. And this is, I think, the real irony is they'll say it's a scientific fact. And yet no one has actually conclusively produced that evidence. So I think if you teach kids about the flaws in white supremacist arguments, and by doing that, I mean the quantitative and the causal flaws in those arguments, that's what needs to be done if you want to change how kids think about race and prevent them from developing white supremacist ideas about race and genetics. And they need it. The key here, and this is what makes people feel uncomfortable, understandably, is that I think the kids need to learn genetics for that purpose. They need to have the opportunity to criticize those arguments, develop those abilities to do that. Because if they don't do that, I don't think it's going to happen automatically. You can't just teach about the complexity of genetics and expect kids to just put it all together. You need to have instructional coherence to make that work. So what I'm arguing for is simple, it's complicated. I think I just spent about 7 minutes describing those concepts, but that unfolds over about a month of instruction in the biology classroom to help kids understand that. But the problem we have is the white supremacist community can take advantage of our ignorance because we never teach about this stuff. And so then you might wonder, well, what does genetics education do? And if you look at the pre-war curriculum, there's a really strong case to be made that it directly contributed to these white supremacist beliefs. This is a biology textbook from the pre-war period called Biology and Human Affairs. It says human race is a matter of biological kinship, not a place of residence. The Caucasian, Australoid, Negroid or woolly-haired, and yellow-brown or Mongoloid are scientifically agreed upon racial classification systems. A biologist expects to find natural differences in people. He's prepared, because all biologists are male in the 1930s, to find great differences in mechanical, artistic, and intellectual ability. He knows that there are innate differences in persons that cannot be removed. And that's hard for people to become reconciled with these differences and to the social and economic difficulties rising out of them. Therefore, an understanding of biology prepares for living more comprehendingly in the world of natural inequalities that we have and will have until all persons are born alike. So, I mean, that's like mic drop quote right there, essentially. So that's what eugenics education looks like in the United States. And behind that argument is a social cognitive bias that we now call genetic essentialism. So this is something that's been studied since Gordon Allport in the 1950s in social psychology. Genetic essentialism is a social cognitive bias that influences the development of stereotyping, dehumanization, a variety of different social psychological processes and behaviors. It's the idea that if there are 3 racial groups, they don't really share a lot of genetic variation. Each group has its own special set of alleles or gene variants that one group has that another group doesn't have. Therefore, we can carve nature right at the joints and reduce all of human inequality, at least racial inequality, down to these different genetic essences that groups have. And these essences are like placeholders, they're undefined. Like, it's not a very scientific view. It's just like the belief that, yeah, there's something there genetically speaking that's driving this, okay? Now, if we look at biology textbooks today, we don't see anything that is remotely genetic essentialist. But race does come up a lot. It comes up, especially in terms of monogenic diseases like sickle cell and cystic fibrosis, for good reason. Sickle cell occurs at a higher prevalence among people of African ancestry. And there's an interesting evolutionary story there for kids to learn. Not saying we shouldn't teach about that. Cystic fibrosis changes clinally, right, with distance away from Northern Europe. Also potentially an interesting story there, although I don't know if we've worked that out yet. But anyways, this is what textbooks will say, like the allele responsible for sickle cell, common among people of African descent, cystic fibrosis, the most common fatal genetic disorder among Caucasians. The problem with these is that potentially these messages are unintentionally reinforcing genetic essentialist views in students. That's the worry that I had when I was in graduate school, and my first kind of research program looked into this. So what I did, well, here's why that's a problem. If you know, African Americans get sickle cell and European Americans get cystic fibrosis, well, it implies that each group is kind of uniform because each individuals in the same group each get their own disease. It certainly implies that the groups are categorically different or discrete because each group gets a different disease, because textbooks don't talk about underdiagnosis of sickle cell anemia in European populations, which happens, for example. And it's not a big step for kids to infer that if disease disparities boil down to variation in a single gene, then perhaps other racial disparities do as well. Kids are sense makers. They come into the classroom with their concepts about race, which they've learned because they grew up in America, and they have concepts about genes because they're prevalent in the media and elsewhere and on movies. Just watch a Marvel movie, right? Spider-Man. My son loves Spider-Man. And so they're bringing all that together to try to make sense of stuff and answer these fundamental questions. Because when they're in middle and high school, they're starting to construct explanations for why there is racial inequality in society. That's what middle schoolers in the United States and high schoolers do. And they walk into the classroom and the teacher gives them sickle cell and cystic fibrosis is the only example of racial difference. Never goes beyond it. And so if that's going on, then potentially kids are unintentionally learning genetic essentialist views in the science classroom. So I ran 3 double-blinded randomized trials in biology classrooms. These are by no means generalizable studies. We can talk about the generalizability. I think they're good randomized trials. They are underpowered because I was in graduate school. I did not have a lot of money to do big studies then, okay? But basically, imagine you're in my classroom. I randomly assign half of you to learn about these 2 genetic diseases with racial terminology, and the other half of you learn about those same diseases without mentioning race. It's like a gene knockout study. I just knocked racial terminology out of the curriculum to study the impact that it actually has when it is in the curriculum. And then we measured belief in genetic essentialism using validated measures. I'm not going to get into the statistics, but if folks want to talk about measurement or statistical models, I'm happy to do so. The main point is that in all 3 studies, we found the same effect, which is that students in the racial condition were significantly more likely to endorse the idea that racial groups differ in intelligence and academic ability because of genes. So if you ask them to explain why is there a racial test score gap in New York City public schools, only kids in the racial condition would say things like this: Black and Hispanic students may have genes that cause them to have a harder time learning. So that's problematic for obvious reasons. It's also problematic because it's not like the textbooks are talking about academic ability or intelligence. They're talking about human genetic diseases. So the kids are making the leap. We usually want them to make the leap. We usually want them to take the tools they learn in science and apply them elsewhere. In this case, it's not going so well, right? And that's one of the reasons why I think we need to move beyond Mendel, because if this hypothesis is correct, then that potentially means that Mendelian genetics education is part of the problem in terms of how the public develops genetic essentialist beliefs about race. And so instead, I think we need to offer what I call a humane genetics education, and that teaches kids about the complexity of genomics for the explicit purpose of refuting genetic essentialist ideas. And some of you might be skeptical, but genetic essentialism was expunged from physical anthropology in the 1950s and for population biology in the 50s by people like Dobzhansky, right? Because it's an inaccurate, it's not consistent with population thinking. It's an inaccurate view of human difference. So there's a long intellectual tradition within biology of talking about this stuff and doing this kind of teaching, right? We just don't do it on a broad scale. So what does that mean? Well, I think kids need to learn these more accurate models of human variability and how to explain it. Once they develop those understandings, they need to then use them to criticize essentialist and determinist arguments and ideas about race. And we've tested that out. So the most recent randomized trial, which is under review right now, we have 1,000 7th to 12th grade students. They got 28 days of instruction, either their business as usual Mendelian curriculum, or what I've just talked about as being humane genetics for 3 weeks. It was a crossover trial. So we had a baseline survey, then classrooms within teachers were randomized to one of these two conditions. They learned for 3 weeks. We measured again. The counterbalance occurs. We measure again, right? I'm not going to get into the details of the cluster randomization. Let me just say that the groups are baseline equivalent on all measures. And talking about measures, we measured their knowledge of complex genomics concepts. So this is like polygenic inheritance, multifactorial inheritance, patterns of genetic variation within and between human populations, such as the decline in heterozygosity that is associated with the founder effect and migration out of Africa, stuff like that. We measured their belief in genetic essentialism, and then the extent to which kids explain complex trait variability among individuals in the same group using genes versus the environment. All right. These are all, my measurement framework is like Roche analysis. So these all have great psychometric qualities. Happy to talk about those measures if people want to talk about them more, but they behave the way you want them to behave for a study like this. This is my research team right here, who helped me carry out this whole study, design the curriculum, do the Roche analysis, do the professional learning for teachers. So it's a big team doing this work. And here's what we found. So we measured knowledge of genomics knowledge of genetic complexity. At baseline, before the experiment begins, the two groups of students do not differ. The standard errors are adjusted at the classroom level for anyone who's into that kind of stuff. Then the kids who get humane genetics, they improve significantly more in their knowledge of genomics relative to the kids who are getting Mendel. Then after the first half of kids have received humane genetics, the two groups are now different in their genomics knowledge. The second half of kids get humane genetics, they improve more in their knowledge of genomics relative to the kids who are now getting Mendel. And then at the end of the study, the kids are significantly greater or higher in their knowledge of genomics than they were at baseline, right? So the kids learned some stuff. That's good, because if they didn't, I wouldn't be able to attribute this to genetics learning. But if we look at belief in genetic essentialism, it's the mirror opposite pattern of results, right? Kids get humane genetics, they decline in their belief in genetic essentialism relative to the kids who are getting Mendel. Two groups are then different. Second group of kids get humane genetics, they decline more in their knowledge of or in their belief in genetic essentialism than the kids who are now getting Mendel. And then the two groups are now the same and significantly lower than they were at the start of the experiment in their belief in genetic essentialism. And if we look at their genetic versus environmental explanations for complex traits, first thing I want to point out is we have mirror opposite parallelograms here, right? So we have basically a decrease in their genetic explanations for complex traits like athleticism and science ability. And we have an increase in their environmental explanations for those same traits. But what's really important right here is this last little effect. So these are the kids who are getting Mendelian genetics after humane genetics. So they got humane genetics first, Mendel second. And you can see there's this slight little, this is actually statistically significant increase in their genetic explanations. This is marginally significant decrease in their environmental explanations. So even after learning about the complexity of genomics for the purpose of refuting essentialist and determinist ideas, once the kids get Mendel, there's a little bit of backsliding here, right? And that begs an explanation, like why didn't we see the same effect on the genetic essentialism measure? Why is it only showing up on this measure? And we can discuss that in Q&A if people are interested. We'll see if you agree with my explanation, and then I'll have to correct my paper that's under review. So anyways, this isn't just like unpublished data. We have other randomized trials that show similar effects on genetic essentialism, that when kids learn humane genetics, there's a decline in genetic essentialist beliefs. We've also tested it with a quasi experiment. Those are all published papers. You can find them. And then my colleague, Jamie, who is now, well, she's not soon to be, she actually is an assistant professor at Occidental now. We actually replicated these results again in a sample of 1,000 undergraduates at UC San Diego. And that paper, probably shouldn't say this, but that paper, all of the results I just shared with you, just got invited for resubmission at Science. So hopefully that will be coming out shortly, as long as they don't blow it. So one other thing to say too as well is that and I'm not showing these results right here, but we've also found two other really important things that are relevant to the large debate that's going on right now about how we should talk about race in US schools. One of the arguments is you talk about race and it's so emotionally fraught and complex, you're going to harm kids emotionally. You hear that in the news. It's a justification everywhere, right? Well, we've actually put that idea to the test. We have measures where kids self-report. These are self-report measures, flawed in some ways. They're positive and negative emotions after instruction. And what we found, at least in this randomized trial that I just shared with you, is that students of color, at least, report lower confusion, anxiety, and frustration while learning with humane genetics materials relative to what they self-reported when learning Mendelian genetics. And then we've also found, and we have unpublished data that we're working with right now, showing that as kids learn humane genetics, there's an increase in their self-reported social belonging in science class, which makes sense because we're talking about identity. We're including your identity in your learning. 40 years of sociocultural research and science education suggests that if you make instruction about what kids are interested in and their identities, then potentially they're going to be more motivated and interested to learn because it's connecting to them. And so that's what we're seeing as well. So as of yet, I don't have any evidence that somehow we are emotionally harming kids by talking about race in the genetics classroom. And probably that's because we do a lot of things to create a psychologically safe learning environment. And we can talk about what that is in the Q&A if people want to. But all of that is why I think humane genetics is reliable. It reliably decreases belief in genetic essentialism. And it's relatively safe, at least emotionally speaking, for doing this kind of work in classrooms. And so if you take my argument to be correct and you think I've proven my point, right, then it kind of implies that we can move beyond Mendel. We teach about the complexity of genomics. We teach a little bit of Mendel. We move beyond it. We teach about this more complex stuff. We can have our cake and eat it too. We can teach about a lot of complex inheritance concepts, and we can get reductions in a form of prejudice, which seems like a win-win combination to me. And we're not going to just do it by teaching about Mendel, right? So if that's accurate, then the next question is who's going to be courageous enough to do this teaching? So that's like, how did it go for Kay? And I think it's important to point out that like Kay took a real risk. Where she teaches in her context, there are students who have family members in the clan. So she's not just teaching to the choir. She's got some challenging, she has a challenging teaching context for this kind of work. Nevertheless, when she finished, she said it was a huge rush, which is the kind of thing you say when you're super freaked out and you prepared a lot and you have that sense of relief. Like I got through it. And maybe I messed up a bunch of stuff, but it more or less is in the ballpark and did okay, right? So she prepared a lot for that challenge. So Kay came to our Professional Learning Institute. It's 40 hours of professional development. That's a lot of time to learn how to teach one unit. And it happens over the summer. Teachers learn with the student materials because they haven't developed this knowledge before, because we don't teach this stuff in schools very often. They learn about how students think with the materials, how kids think about race, and how they think about genetics, the difficulties of learning genetics, of which there are many. They learn like how we design the intervention, what the instructional scaffolds are to promote safety and help kids learn, analyze and interpret data, argue from evidence, build and construct and revise models. Lot of professional learning going on. And then they learn about a bunch of work on prejudice, in particular, genetic essentialism. What is it? What does it do? Kind of thing. And Kay said that because she had experienced the unit herself as a student, like she was learning through a student hat, just learning the genetics. She had a PhD in molecular biology, right? She felt prepared, essentially. She was confident about what kids might ask and, what the kind of content of the questions might be that kids would raise in the classroom. Because that's the scariest thing for most people is like, oh my God, like, what are kids going to say? Am I opening a can of worms right now by having this discussion in my class? So we prepare for that, practice for that. Just like you would do in any high-risk situation, you practice again and again and again, so it's automatic. And we help teachers to discern between the conceptual content of what kids are asking about from the way affectively they are asking the question. And we help teachers develop practices to check in with kids who seem defensive or irritated or frustrated or shut down, because there's good reason for all of that to occur. And so a teacher needs to be, you have to be a human being, you have to have some empathy and look around the room and see what's going on, read the room and talk with kids after class to do this kind of work. You don't do it on day one of school. You don't do it in the first semester. You do it toward the end of the year when you have relationships and rapport with kids, right? But that kind of teaching and learning can have a big impact on kids. So this is from one of Kay's students. Their parent actually says, I thought you would like to know. My son said that your class changed the way he perceives the world, and he's not entirely comfortable with that, which is like, as a teacher, that's the kind of thing I'd love to hear. It's like we worked with a worldview that we have, and we made some progress and changed it and thought about it, right? As a social scientist, I want to know, well, how frequent is that experience? Like, how many kids need to receive humane genetics in order to create one wholesale change in how a kid thinks about race? That's called the number needed to treat. So in this question, like, what's the number needed to treat to get one kid from believing in genetic essentialism to not believing it without getting into the methods? The number is 14. So in a classroom of 30, we would predict that 2 kids would go from believing to not believing in genetic essentialism if the entire class were to learn humane genetics. So to put that number in perspective, if all 15 million kids in the US, high school students, got humane genetics next year, then roughly 1 million of them, we would predict, we don't know, this is a prediction, would go from believing to not believing in genetic essentialism. And that's 52% of the estimated total population of US high school students who might be exposed to racist misinformation online at some point during their high school learning experience. So if you want to have that kind of broad impact, we need much more research on these findings. They're preliminary proof of concept findings. Standards and curriculum and teacher education need to change, and there's a lot to discuss right there. But more importantly, we need public support for the work, which is the hardest thing to come by right now in the current context in which we find ourselves with discussions about race and gender in US schools, right? Because this is never going to happen unless parents and communities get behind this kind of work. And if we don't do anything about it, then I think, what we need to acknowledge is that what we're allowing for is misinformation about race and genetics to spread online. Every day it does. That still goes on behind the scenes all the time. And really, genetics education is like the one place where we could systematically make a real dent in this problem. We're not going to solve racism through teaching genetics. It comes in many different forms. It manifests in many different ways. But it could be one small, but nevertheless, like, pretty important thing that we do. That's within our tradition as biologists, as population geneticists in particular. We've done this in the past, so we can do it again. And that's why I want to move genetics education beyond Mendel. If you are an undergraduate faculty instructor, and you want to participate in the study, you can scan that QR code right there. We're running randomized trials right now of learning materials. These materials don't have anything to do about race, actually. They're just about multifactorial inheritance. And we're studying impacts on belief in genetic determinism and STEM motivation and interest. It's an NSF-funded research project under the Improving Undergraduate STEM Education competition. And if you want to reach out to me, you can do this, my email. A lot of the work that I talked about is summarized in this paper, and then keep your eyes peeled for potentially a paper in the future. Thank you.
Great question. Yeah. How are you?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a couple of things. The one is that I think it might be important to make a distinction between the types of traits that we talk about. So I think social or behavioral genomics, I think is very different the way we should discuss them versus biomedical, for example. Because I think we want to also show how genomics can help human life, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, and the other question I have, I guess, is that I think the biggest issue would be scalability, right? Because, I mean, it works when we have the time and the resources to teach particular features or something. But I mean, I work with people who have PhDs and are professors who have a hard time even explaining some of these topics in class. So I imagine it will be very hard for high school, like Harvard, right? So
yeah.
Any thoughts on scalability?
Yeah. Did you review my paper recently? Because those are similar points. I've heard them before. Yeah. So I think on the distinction between disease-related traits and biomedical issues or disparities versus social behavioral outcomes. I actually think doing this work, and we're dealing with social behavioral outcomes in our teaching, right? I think it's really important to make that distinction. I think one of the problems that we have right now with like race-based biomedical research in particular is we're talking past each other quite often because, there's a lot of folks who are doing race-based biomedicine and looking at genomic effects on diseases. And they think their argument, like I'm thinking of Neil Risch, for example, is that we're reducing disparities. We're paying attention to something we haven't in the past. But then what happens is there's plenty of studies conducted by social scientists who say, well, when you get people to think about racial differences in disease that have a genetic basis, they basically do the same thing that happened in the study that I did with sickle cell anemia and cystic fibrosis. They extrapolate to social and behavioral traits. And so then that creates this kind of fundamental divide, well, it's probably already there, between how folks in health-related fields or biologists who are talking about this stuff versus folks in the social sciences. And I think if we could do a really good job of challenging genetic essentialist beliefs about social and behavioral outcomes, and also talk about physical outcomes in a way that respects the population biology, in a way that addresses the variance within and between groups, not being consistent with like what an essentialist thinker would predict, then we can kind of stop talking past each other and have our cake and eat it too, potentially. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, in my view, I think social behavioral genomics is definitely more influenced by ideology than by medical genomics. So I think it's important to make that distinction, right? Like how educational attainment view us may not be really equivalent to a cardiovascular disease device, for example.
I can get on board with that.
Yeah, and the other one was scalability.
Oh yeah, scalability. I mean, scalability is something that we've struggled with in the current study that we have with the roughly 1,000 high school students. They're from 6 states. There's some software now online that was developed by Beth Tipton at Columbia. It's called the Generalizer. So it basically uses propensity score matching to look at your sample of school IDs from the NCES database, and then it looks at basically how well are you filling in the strata in a propensity score analysis of all the schools in the United States, for example, and then it gives you a generalizability coefficient. So to the extent that you want to believe that all that works, right? What we have in our most recent study is that what's called like medium to high generalizability in 20 US states. So what that essentially means is that the treatment effects that we estimate in our study are going to be relatively unbiased if you were to sample in those states. Like you might get some inflation in the standard errors, but the actual like point estimate, the beta on that effect is not going to deviate in any kind of significant way. So we're honing in on what is potentially, you know, a true population effect in those areas. But we can't really know that for sure because it's so difficult to recruit schools to do this work. And it's, you know, we started that last study in 2019 before the pandemic, before George Floyd was murdered, before the CRT controversy. We finished it last year. We had teachers drop out because they were afraid of parental backlash and not being supported by administrators. We were on track to reach a sample size of 90 classrooms, which would have been a well-powered trial. We only got 52. Our effect sizes were bigger than we had planned, so we're actually like good in power. But that's the big barrier that we face in testing a lot of these ideas. We need kind of a critical mass of educators who are going to do this work to really kick the tires on it, to see if it's even worthy of scaling, if it's going to work in different places, right? And so at present, we just don't know. And the process through which research is approved in schools is not based on the merits of the research or the ethical benefits and whether or not the benefits outweigh the risks. It's purely to cover schools from legal consequences. So it's basically become, I won't say impossible, but incredibly difficult to do this work.
First of all, thank you. This is really fascinating, and I appreciate you sharing the work with us. I think the humane genetics approach is really important and really compelling. My question to you is how far will that get us? And what I'm asking is, it seems to me that if we really want kids to be anti-racist kids, it takes more than just the genetic foundation. There needs to be an understanding of systemic racism and implicit bias and all of those other sociological and historical factors as well. And I know you're saying it's hard enough just to do this, let alone introduce that element as well. But do you think that, how far do you think humane genetics can get us? And what about these other aspects that shape people's thinking?
It's a great question. And it brings up so many issues. One, like, you know, to what extent is knowledge context specific and developed in certain contexts, and then how easily does it transfer across contexts? And 50 years of educational research suggests it's very hard to do that, to get transfer across contexts. So in that sense, I think a lot of the things that, you know, we've developed, the materials we developed probably have, we know they affect kids like at least a month afterwards. We know that, we've measured that. Potentially longer. We don't know, and does it transfer to another context? So if a kid walks out to their locker after class, we have no idea what they're thinking, or if they're actually going to behave in a way consistent with, you know, the values and attitudes and beliefs that are embodied in our curriculum, right? We do know that our results are not biased by social desirability bias. We've tested that out. And there's a case to be made that, yeah, every subject area can contribute something. And it's through that kind of integrated approach that you get a long-term effect. We have no evidence that, I know you got to go, Fred. We have no evidence, I see you on the side of my head. We have no evidence that like affective forms of prejudice are changing. It's like cognitive, it's like rationalizations and stuff like that. So I'm selling myself in this idea short, I think. But then the punchline is, you never know what happens when you give everyone a common experience to talk about in society and common ideas and a touchstone. So if everyone got humane genetics, literally, if we actually did that, everyone got it, you have no idea what kind of downstream reciprocal cultural effects might occur, what new conversations might occur, where people might go. So it's almost like an impossible question to answer for that reason, because it's just, to get to that scale, it'd be already doing a lot. So I think it matters It's important. We should do it. But like I said before, it's not the solution to all of our problems in society when it comes to racial inequality. That's probably a good place to end.
Before we thank Brian for his talk, I know there are other people who have questions. Brian's gonna be here tomorrow. We have sessions set up for him to meet with groups of people. If you go to the web where we announce this thing, you can sign yourself up and meet with him later. We're trying to use his visit as best as we can. So let's thank Brian.
Thank you. And tomorrow I'll be talking about gender essentialism, so it'll be even more controversial. So.